at Jallianwala Bagh, just across the border, about 32 miles from Lahore, in Amritsar. This, of course, I'm sure a lot of you must have heard about this from history books, from classes, and from general social media even. But even though people knew that there was a massacre and people were killed by British troops, there was a lot of haze around what actually happened, what transpired, the details around it. So we are very pleased that we have the author of the book, Dr. Wagner, who's a professor of global history. I think that's the title, right? Global and Imperial History at Queen Mary at the University of London. He has just published a book, right coinciding, of course, with the 100-year anniversary of the massacre. It happened in April 1919. And in conversation with him, we'll have our local historian, Ammar Ali Jan. And I'll also be there to, interject whenever, at certain points. So I think it'll be an interesting discussion, and we should have about 15-20 minutes for questions at the end also. So over to you, Ammar.
Thank you, Yaqub, and thank you everyone for coming to the event. So this is, I've recently read Kim's work. He was my colleague in the UK. And this is a fascinating book, not only because it details what happened in one of the most momentous events in the subcontinent's history. And one can claim that it was probably a trigger for the birth of popular and mass movements in the subcontinent. So it has this event is very important in the nationalist imagination in this region. But also, the details, if you read the details of the event, both before the Jallianwala Bagh and what happened after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, I think there are a lot of lessons in it on themes as diverse as colonial violence, state making in the subcontinent, and the role of fear. I mean, this is something very interesting that Dr. Kim Wagner has done, is that he's looking at emotions or anxieties in state making or in governance. And something as simple as fear that we all experience in our personal lives as well. How central that theme has been in modern state making in South Asia. I mean, this is an empire, and one of the claims that Kim makes is that this is an empire of fear. Another friend of ours, the Mark Wonders, called it the insecure state. Not the security state, but the insecurity state. So we're going to have a discussion on what is the meaning of this massacre and what can this massacre reveal about colonial governance, empire, and then perhaps what is its legacy for today in the subcontinent. So I'll begin with a brief discussion of the centrality of the theme of fear, because you start your book not with 1919 but with 1857. So what is the continuity or the spectre of 1857, and where do you place fear in colonial governance?
Thank you. Thanks, Jakob, and the organisers for the invitation. Fear is somewhat counterintuitively what I would argue, at least, is central to the British colonial state in India, which we usually associate. I mean, imperialism is about dominance of others and the conquest of others. And in many ways, you can say that British rule in India was quite secure, at least after 1857, right up till 1947. The British are not driven out by nationalists. It's global forces, amongst other things, that causes that eventually. So how can you argue that what appears to be the strongest empire and one that quite regularly takes recourse to extreme violence? How does that work with fear? Because fear we usually associate with weakness. And so what I would argue is that the colonial state was, objectively speaking, strong, fairly secure in its rule of the South Asian subcontinent. But there is a misconception. There is what Chris Bailey has referred to as information panic, but there is, and others have talked about it in the context of American politics, a paranoid style. There is a disjuncture between the realities of the political situation and the strength of colonial rule in India, and then how the British perceived it. And they did perceive it as being far less secure, and they perceived themselves to be far more vulnerable than they actually were. And so acting out of fear, because of an inability to breed the land. I mean, we have this trope about the British having a special kind of sort of soft type of colonialism and using cultural knowledge, and contrary to the French in Algeria or the Belgians in Congo, the British had a certain soft touch. But the fact is that that's not really true. There was always brute force ready to back up any sense of unrest. And so you already brought up 1857, which for me is sort of a crucial moment in establishing this particular narrative, which goes something like this. British rule in India is obviously a good thing. Who would reasonably reject the blessings of Western civilization? That's the British argument.
That's not game time.
No. That's a British argument, right? So if there is anti-colonial movements, they are by definition irrational and also illegitimate. You cannot legitimately oppose the colonial state. So if there is any kind of unrest or protest, no matter how moderate, it must be due to agitators or seditionists. Usually, when we get into the 20th century, Western-educated seditionists and nationalists. And so the way that the British perceive rule in India after 1857 is about curbing this propensity or the potential for escalation. And that really drives an exaggerated sense of threat. There's a siege mentality in British India after 1857.
So getting right into the event, what is it about this time period, 1914 to 1919? I mean, of course, it's the World War. But what, like, reading your book, it's almost seemed like militarization became part of the colonial logic of governance. I mean, there's this panic, this fear that there will be mutinies, this fear there will be sedition. Why were they so scared in that decade in particular?
So first of all, Punjab is the heartland of Indian loyalism. It is the recruitment ground for a large part of the Indian colonial soldiers. And therefore it is extremely important for the British to keep that under control. It is, as sort of the story goes, thanks to the support and loyalty of Sikhs and Punjabis that the British are able to suppress the 1857 uprising and restore authority. So any kind of unrest in what is supposed to be the heartland of loyalism is extremely worrying, because, as in any colonial situation, there are very, very few Goras there. Colonial rule can only be maintained through the reliance on local allies. That applies to any colonial concept, really. And that's also why the 1857 uprising looms so large, because British rule is ultimately underwritten by Indian soldiers. So you have this Punjab, as we get into the 20th century, you have the emergence of actual anti-colonial nationalism. You have the Gado movement, of course, which is part sort of returned North American migrants. But you also have anti-colonial agitation. There's unrest in Lahore in 1907 against some of the policies that are imposed by the British. So that's one part of it, that Punjab is the sort of bastion of British rule, and therefore the British are extremely sensitive about the way it's ruled. But then, of course, we also have the global dislocation of the 1914-1918 period, which not only interrupts global trade, which, for instance, hits Amritsar extremely hard, since it relies on, there's a lot of skin trade to Germany, there's a lot of dyes used for the weaving and these kind of things. All of that gets interrupted. But on top of that, you have more than 1 million Indian soldiers participating in the First World War. There's a widespread support for British rule in India throughout the First World War, with the exception of the Bagh movement and a few anti-colonial politicians. You have the global flu pandemic, which kills, I think, something like 12 million Indians in 1918, and you have a succession of famines and droughts. So 1919 is really sort of a perfect storm in terms of uncertainty. Uncertainty on the British part, because they know that they need to maintain the loyalty of Punjab. So you have the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, which promises very, very limited and at some point in the future, greater in contribution to local governance, regional governance. So there is a carrot. At the same time, there's also the stick, which is the Rowlatt Act, which sort of kicks everything off. And the Rowlatt Act, in many ways, is a continuation of wartime emergency measures, but it's also what we can see today as the precursor of anti-terrorism legislation. It means the suspension of the habeas corpus. It means that there's no such thing as free press. Any kind of protest can be clamped down on. People can be arrested without and put on trial without any evidence. And so Gandhi is recruiting for the British right until 1918. There's nobody in 1919 who actually calls for Indian independence. That concept doesn't yet exist. But then you have the Rowlatt Act, which seemed to be a blatant slap in the face for all the sacrifices that Indians they have made, combined with the sort of global economic unrest at the same time.
So basically you have censorship, you have an economic crisis, and you have global volatility, and that triggers the Jallianwala event. You beautifully describe what the events leading up to Jallianwala from March all the way to April, and there are these two figures that are very prominent in your work. One is Dr. Satyapal, and the other is Saifuddin Kishki. If you could talk a little bit about the way they started organizing in March 1919, and what are the events that led to this eventual tragedy on the 13th of April?
So the Rowlatt Act, this is the moment when Gandhi comes to the fore, and he manages to we see mass mobilization for the first time in India. I mean, Gandhi only returned from South Africa in 1915, but the Rowlatt Act affected all Indians, which means for the first time there is something very concrete, which is not anti-British, actually. The protesters against the Rowlatt Act invoke the authority of the British king to make the Indian government stop the Rowlatt Act. I mean, it's a complex kind of protest, but you have tens of thousands of people who gather at, for instance, Jallianwala Bagh, which is this space, sort of half wasteland, part public park in Amritsar for political meetings. But you also have throughout Punjab and Lahore as well. There's these mass gatherings, which is not something the British are used to, but. Satyapal and Kishki, I mean, they also tied into the Khilafat movement at the same time. So the kind of protest kind of brings together a whole lot of different grievances under one umbrella. And that sort of triggers the panic reaction in the British government, and in particular with the Lieutenant Governor Michael O'Dwyer, who's sitting just next door really at the time. And from a British perspective, there's no such thing as a peaceful Indian crowd. We have to remember these are mass gatherings with 10, 20, 30,000 people coming together, listening to speeches which are not calling for Indian independence, they're not calling for a second mutiny. But that is how the British, they perceive it. Because there is no such thing as a peaceful Indian crowd. Any gathering of Indians is a threat to colonial authority, and is as we know, the sort of studies of the mob and the mass, and the mob is volatile, it's irrational. It's doubly so when you have the racial aspect in it as well.
So, and that actually is something that we can talk about when we open questions to the audience. This idea of a gathered crowd, the fear of a crowd, the fear of a crowd turning into a violent mob, how that's etched into the consciousness of bureaucrats and state officials in modern South Asia, and that's part of this legacy of fear. Now, before I have a couple of questions, and one question that I really think it would be very interesting for the audience to hear about is this mysterious, hated character known as General Dyer, who is, of course, participates in one of the most brutal or spectacular forms of violence on the Indian people. And there are these contrary opinions about it. And very few people, for example, would know that he was seen as a hero and defended by a lot of people in the UK. You've also met his granddaughter, great-granddaughter. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about this character and the way he created a public debate and continues to create public debate about imperial violence.
So there are riots in Amritsar during which 5 Europeans effectively lynched by Indian protesters after the British had opened fire and killed about 20, 30. It's one of the characteristics of colonial violence. There's always this disproportionality. In one white person killed justifies killing dozens of Indians. There's actually, so there's, on the 10th of April, there's this sort of outbreak, and there's widespread and extremely serious riots. But after that, there's unrest elsewhere in Lahore, elsewhere outside of Amritsar. But Amritsar is actually quite calm. But the British, they massed troops into Amritsar. They sent armored trains, they sent armored cars, they sent airplanes, Royal Air Force, and British and Indian troops. And then General Dyer turns up. Now, General Dyer is not this uniquely evil guy. He's has sort of had a quite unspectacular career so far. He's been active in Ireland, so he's had some experience of riots, but he's also been fighting in Burma, the northwest frontier, and he's in Persia during the First World War. So the whole idea about that he had sort of somehow suffered, trauma in the trenches doesn't quite hold water. But he is brought in, he's the third British officer who takes charge of Amritsar within 24 hours. Because from the very top, from the Indian government, hold there in Shimla at that point, there is an expectation that harsh measures have to be taken. And the previous officers have been unwilling to do so because after the riots on the 10th of April, everything has been quite peaceful. But Dyer arrives and he doesn't have the orders to do something, but there's the expectation, a clear expectation. And when he hears there's another mass meeting at Jallianwala Bagh, he sees it as a declaration of war. And when he enters Amritsar, the Indian city, which is still surrounded by walls and has this sort of labyrinth of narrow alleys, what he is entering is a war zone, is enemy territory. So if we think of the Richard Attenborough Gandhi movie, which is what most of us refer to in terms of a visual point of reference, you have a sort of peaceful crowd listening to Gandhi's words of non-violence, and then you have an evil Raj coming in, marching in, and it makes no sense. But you can see from the way that the British prepare for it, General Dyer, he thinks it's Black Hawk Down. He has 1,000 troops under his command. He only takes 90 Gurkhas and Baluch Sikh frontier force troops with him. All the British troops he posted around the city gates of Amritsar, not to surround the city, but to extricate him if he's ambushed. He literally thinks that he will be attacked, which is why he takes armored cars. And then he comes across this big meeting. There is a political meeting. It's very, very tame. We actually have the speeches that are being given. They ask for the political leaders, Kijiko and Satyapal, to be released, but it's also by Saki. So there's lots of pilgrims there. There's children playing. There's some gamblers there. This is a public space. Maybe 15, 20,000 people we won't know for sure. So, I mean, there's no sort of, gutter rights. There's no seditionists there. But for Dyer, it's a bloodthirsty crowd just waiting to attack the British. And so he acts on the lessons of community, which is the only language natives understand is violence. And therefore he lines up 50 troops, they open fire for 10 minutes and spend 1,650 rounds. Dyer hasn't been there before, he doesn't sort of plan this, it's sort of a panic reaction. But there are a few exits, but they quickly get blocked. And so we have this horrific outcome, which is the British only acknowledge 379 people are killed and about 1,200 wounded. Having studied this for a number of years, and we'll never know for sure. I would say probably 500 to 600 people are killed and 3 times that wounded. The exact numbers don't really matter. The fact is that British are quite willing to simply massacre Indians in order, and this is very, very important, in order to send a message, not just to the people who are there, not just to the people of Amritsar, but to all of Punjab, and in effect to all of India, because that's what colonial violence is. There's no sense of individual guilt. It doesn't matter who gets blown from a cannon or who gets massacred. What matters is the message of brute force that is sent. And that's so after they open fire, they leave after 10 minutes, and then there's a curfew, which means that the dead and the wounded can't be removed, and also the hospital personnel, both British and Indian, in Amritsar are forbidden to treat people, so the casualties are increased. And it's not this sort of nefarious, well, on some level it is, but I would say it's criminal negligence and complete indifference to Indian lives rather than any sort of calculated plan to kill as many Indians as possible. I mean, maybe it's a fine distinction. But, so yeah.
You're not mentioning that crowd is totally unarmed.
Oh, but yeah.
And General Dyer comes with his armored cars and military. He's a general in the British Army. I mean, how can you fire on an unarmed crowd?
I think that's what he's suggesting.
But the point is, it is an unarmed crowd. There's no question about it. There's women and children.
He's mentioned that.
No, but I just said, they're there for political meetings, they're pilgrims there, of course they're unarmed.
It's a peaceful gathering of people who are talking about...
Yes, thank you. I think it's, so we continue the discussion on the next aspect. I mean, it's clear that I think it's very clear from what Dr. K was saying, that it's a peaceful protest and there was no intent for violence. And that's why the interesting bit is that General Dyer saw it, a peaceful protest, as a declaration of war. And that was part of this colonial logic that if Indians are gathered, that is a threat to the lives of Europeans. And that's part of this racialized thinking in which colonial governance took place. Now, you mentioned the effect that Jallianwala Bagh was intended to have. I mean, part of it was to paralyze this movement, to create fear.
This non-existent movement, right? There is no
At this point, there's no movement, absolutely. And so my question is, you have this really interesting part about fanciful punishments. I mean, there's, the kinds of punishments that would be, that would horrify anybody. I mean, right after the Jallianwala takes place, people are forced to crawl in a street in Amritsar. There's also this law made in Kasoor and Gujranwala that if you see a white person, you have to leave whatever you're doing and salute that person. And then, of course, Gujranwala becomes the first city in the world that is bombed, aerially bombed in peace times. And then the next one is Waziristan. What is the point of these punishments? I mean, it seems like law is no longer important. These are clearly beyond law, beyond the constitution, beyond the rules, which then begs the question, where exactly is the place of law in colonial governance and violence, particularly after Jallianwala?
So martial law is invoked actually 3 days after the massacre, but it's then backdated to 2 weeks before. So on the one hand, martial law allows the British to do pretty much whatever they want in terms of arresting people, but the real reason they're actually quite honest in the letters to each other about it makes it much easier to convict all the people they've been arresting. So it's basically a carte blanche to arrest and imprison people without any real evidence. But because there's a martial law regime, it also means a suspension of civil law. And that's where you have these improvised types of punishment, which are quite explicitly designed to terrorize the local population. So you have men, young boys even, as young as 15, being publicly flogged while their parents are watching and crying. We've got quite heartbreaking accounts of these things, which is, again, intended as these spectacles of performative power. And again, it doesn't really matter whether or not these boys have done anything. Quite often it's random people. And why are the British doing this? We can, there's clearly a colonial mindset, but they're also acting out of fear. This is the British in 1919, after the First World War. They have been in India for well over a century, and yet they were taken by surprise, and they overreacted. They massacred people. But there's a real sense of the British panicking. Martial law, of course, also means you can shut down any kind of press. So actually, Punjab is closed off to the rest of the world, which is why news of what has happened, details of what has happened, doesn't reach London until December 1919, much later. When Jallianwala Bagh happens on the 13th of April, there's no martial law, but the civil authorities have handed over authority to the military. That doesn't actually exist. That's not a legal thing. You either have martial law or you have civil law. You can't have somewhere in between. And the British are quite happy to operate in this grey area. And I think that really speaks to the function of law in a colonial context. Law is not about punishing the guilty. It's about enabling, it's facilitating these spectacular forms of violence, which can be invoked because, if you don't nip this in the bud, it will escalate and become a second mutiny. And therefore, any kind of repression is justified. I mean, Dyer himself says there could be no question of undue severity. And that's, they feel justified in what they're doing, but they also need that sort of legal loopholes, which emergencies create quite easily.
Just answer the question, sir.
So, final question from my side, and then we'll go to you. So this, of course, they're trying to stop a movement, but by panicking, they actually give birth to a mass movement. And one of the, in fact, largest and most successful movements of the colonial period, and actually leads to the first instance of decolonization anywhere. And Jallianwala Bagh, I think, plays a central role in all of that. My question is, how is this event remembered today in India, in Pakistan, and more importantly, in the UK? Because it seems like unlike Nazi Germany that actually recognized its crimes, it seems like the British Empire, the UK has never been able to reconcile itself, or never able to acknowledge or recognize its imperial violence. Your take?
Well, that's quite. On Amritsar, as it happens, does not contain a single correct statement. What Shashi Tharoor did, he remembered the novel he wrote in the 90s called The Great Indian Novel, which has a fictionalized version of Jallianwala Bagh, and that's what he's actually describing in his book. Which just goes, I'm sympathetic to his argument that yes, we do need a critical account of the British rule in India. I don't think Shashi Tharoor's way is the right way. And also, the interesting thing is, it takes away any Indian agency. What the British did to India, the soldiers that fired at Jallianwala Bagh were Nepalese and Baluch and Sikh. I mean, British rule couldn't have existed without Indian, I don't want to use the word collaboration, but Indian allies. That's the state of it. You can't say that nothing good comes out of British rule in India. I mean, the Indian nationalist movement is in large part also a product of the colonial encounter. So it's an entirely one-sided argument. The real problem I have with this particular notion of Amritsar is that Amritsar is reduced to simply a symbol of the iniquities of the Raj. And it becomes a byword for colonial violence without any real interest or attempt at understanding what actually happened. You can say Bloody Sunday, you can say Amritsar, you can say Mauma, you can say Sharpeville. They're just words, but they don't actually mean anything. And people will say, "Oh, Dyer, he was evil." Yeah, you can say Hitler was evil. That's not actually a meaningful engagement with the past. I think it's altogether too easy. On the other hand, you have today in Britain, and especially after the Brexit referendum and the recent very tragic election. I'm one of the dirty foreigners who've been told not to feel at home in the UK after 20 years. It's not exactly, since you mentioned General Dyer's great-granddaughter, whom I know, I wouldn't call her a friend. When I talked to her, she cried because she felt her great-grandfather had been given an unfair treatment in the press and by historians. And what really bothered her was the book called The Butcher of Amritsar, and that really hurt her. And she's got pictures of her great-grandfather on the wall, and she believes the colonial account that he saved in British India. He saved Memsahibs from being raped. That kind of narrative, which is unbelievable, but still exists. But there's also this idea that, and that's where the Churchill comes in, because Churchill is always cited. Because Churchill, he actually criticized Dyer quite strong terms. He talked about the Amritsar as a singular event in sinister isolation. And so people use that and say, even Churchill says that Dyer was wrong. And that's really throwing Dyer under the bus and then coming up with this sort of rotten apple narrative that Dyer was one single Englishman, a rogue officer who went rogue, and that is not what the British Empire was about. The British Empire was great. It did make the trains run on time, all that crap. And we have this one guy, we have this one event. And that's why, on the one hand, I've written a book about Amritsar, but I also don't, in a sense, want to overemphasize Amritsar as something that's singular and as this one moment. That's why I spent a lot of time in the book to actually talk about other things, because it's not a unique event, and it is in many ways reflective of the nature of colonial rule. But I'm still struggling to get that narrative through.
I also use this opportunity to ask some questions, but just from your last point, when you talk about sort of like the British reaction to it, I was wondering that, what I found really fascinating is that when it's sort of discussed in Parliament and, the committee sort of looks at it, the view is, again, when you were saying that, how an incident is kind of isolated in a particular manner, the view was, oh, this is not something that the British can actually do. So it's rather than the shock at so many people dying, they don't actually really worry about that. That's a number that, could be 379, could be 800, could be 5,000. It's like, oh my God, Brits did that? Britain did that? This is not what we are. And how does that kind of relate to kind of a British imagination of the world and of their kind of role there and of India? And how does that kind of pan out into, because it's really fascinating where in India perhaps they could have said, as you say, that there's the image of 1857 about everything falling apart if you let this go. So on the one side there is this fear, on the other side there is this unbelief that how could a Britain do something like this? How does one reconcile this dichotomy there?
Well, that's also why I object to people quoting Churchill on this matter, because Churchill was not an anti-imperialist. He was not opposed to violence. A few months after he denounced Dyer, he sends the Black and Tans to Ireland. And I don't have to tell you about what else Churchill did, right? So it's ridiculous to quote Churchill to prove that all Englishmen, they thought this was a horrible thing. There was widespread support for Dyer, and Dyer was not unique. When he returned to the UK, the Morning Post organised a collection of £26,000, which is more than £1 million in today's money, from people that's like, the local women's club in Lahore and all sorts of places, and 5 shillings and £5. There is a popular support for Dyer as a defender of the Raj, as he's described as the savior of India. And of course all the conservatives in Britain, who at this point are quite conservative. The Morning Post, just a few years later, they published parts of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as a newspaper coverage of something new. There's a kind of, anti-Semitism we barely believe as a mainstream. Yeah, so Dyer is never punished. He's forced to retire, and he loses parts of his pension. But he's already on sick leave, so he's not. It's barely a slap on the wrist. He just can't, serve in the army again. So the House of Commons, they support that decision, and it's upheld, but then the House of Lords support Dyer. And there is a big libel case in 1924, instigated by Michael O'Dwyer, during which a High Court judge in London says, it's about an Indian lawyer who has said something bad about O'Dwyer. But in the actual judgment, the High Court judge says Dyer was unfairly punished. So the whole idea that all Englishmen were horrified about what happened is simply not true. There were definitely some, but there were also a lot of support for Dyer. Now, so why did Churchill denounce him? Well, because Dyer's actions were so obvious, and Dyer the way he talked about it, made it so difficult to defend the empire, right? And that's why Churchill literally has to say this is not the British way of doing things, while at the same time they're bombing villages. Like, in a sense, Dyer exposes the plot. He says out loud what everybody is thinking at the time, and that's why he, in a sense, has to be sacrificed. Yes, he's definitely responsible for his actions, but it's also not analytically sustainable to single him out as being this one unique person.
Well, that brings me to the other person who by the end of it was assassinated also, the Lieutenant Governor. If you can say a few words about how that kind of comes in and out, and by the end of it, it's so it's not General Dyer who by the end of it is assassinated. It's the Lieutenant Governor. How does that kind of tie into the whole sort of the blame game? You have to find someone which you blame on him, but by the end of it, it's the governor also is very clearly implicated into the whole thing.
Yeah. So Dyer is the only officer who's punished by the British government. But although there, as you mentioned, there's these fancy punishments in all sorts of places. The British are machine gunning peasant rioters, dropping bombs in Jallianwala and strafing them with machine guns. I mean, just a few days before Dyer even arrives at Amritsar, there's talk about bombing the Golden Temple from the air with airplanes. So Dyer is not even the most extreme British officer. And he has the undying support of O'Dwyer, the Lieutenant Governor, who really, so Dyer has a stroke in 1920-21 and kind of disappears from the public view, and he passes away in 1927 in a nice little cottage bought with the money that was collected for him. But O'Dwyer, he has this libel trial which really ties O'Dwyer and Dyer together, to the point that when Udham Singh, he carries out the assassination in 1940, he doesn't mistake O'Dwyer for Dyer. But in terms of responsibility, O'Dwyer is as good as Dyer.
It's transferred, yeah.
Yeah. So there's an interesting sense of transference there.
Oh, it is quite fascinating, because once I was looking into the history of Lahore, and as a lot of Lahoris here know, that a lot of our streets are named after either British governors or civil servants. I always joke about the fact that however many times the government wants to change the name of Lawrence Road, everyone will still call it Lawrence Road. I once counted in the last 72 years, Lawrence Road has been renamed 14 times. But what John and Henry Lawrence did, I think perhaps no one else has actually done in terms of developing the city, and Lawrence Gardens and all those other kinds of things. But it's very fascinating. There's this very interesting minute when he's actually assassinated, and there's a discussion which I found just by chance, that they wanted him commemorated somehow, and he's the only governor that's never commemorated. Because by 1940 it's impossible for the British to even consider that. So there's no O'Dwyer Road in Lahore. Every other governor you can sort of find it, or even a small civil servant who has actually done anything. But by that time, it kind of shifts. The last thing, and because I'm so eager to ask questions too, but the last question, and then we will open it up. You talk about in the book, a bit about the numbers, and whereas the numbers and the well, were there people actually jumping into the well, what was really actually happening there. Could you speak a bit about how it's kind of, the post-history of it is commemorated in India? In Pakistan, we kind of think that, okay, something happened in Amritsar. And the memorial that it's there, it's kind of Disney-fied to a great extent. You would kind of, the way they've kind of commemorated it, and the numbers that are claimed are fantastic. And it's really fascinating. It actually reminds me of a whole conversation about, people dying at massacres and everything. By the end of it, it's actually not about numbers. Even one person dying is pretty bad. But the bizarre thing is, the whole thing is, no. If we even say 379, which is the official figure, or let's say, as you said, say about 500 or so, even if it's that, there's this bizarre sense that, if you claim 500, that doesn't seem enough. We have to claim thousands. So how do you think the memory of it is played out in India? And do you think it still kind of plays a role in the imagination of the Indian nation?
Oh, very much so. I mean, there was a lot of, Shashi Tharoor's boosted his profile by, calling for an apology.
I should say we should learn from Shashi how to write and sell books. Because that's how fiction works.
Exactly, fiction. Jallianwala Bagh has been reduced to sort of a slogan that you can beat the British over the head with. And it doesn't really matter what happens. When you go to the memorial site itself, which I've spent many hours there, and it's quite impossible to commune with the dead because there's too many tourists and school classes. School buses are sort of driven in, and they do drawings of this. I find it quite untasteful, this sort of rather phallic sculpture.
It is.
Yeah, and there's also these commemorative buildings and structures which are from the 1960s. And then the school children, they do drawings of either the monument or of Udham Singh or Bhagat Singh. And there's now a statue of Udham Singh at the entrance. There's also a statue of Udham Singh at the entrance to the walled city, despite the fact there's no real evidence that Udham Singh was present at the massacre and he didn't actually claim it himself even. But it's not really important, but that just goes to show that the Amritsar massacre has been reduced to a symbol. And it's really, what is it seen as? It's seen as the opening shot of the process that led to independence in 1947. But that's the only way it is interesting. That's the only importance it has. So, who died there? They're called martyrs, the sort of mingled blood of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, obviously written, after a secular India was established. But they're important only insofar as they inspired the independence movement. And so it's really a memorial to a sort of muscular resistance, rather than sort of what I would argue happened, which is a much more complicated event. I mean, there were people who went there and thought it was a British order that you had to go to the park and listen to a speech. I mean, you can't even say that the people who went there, they were what their politics were, which historically makes it more interesting. But it also makes it really, if you look at it, it's far more difficult to yoke it to a sort of a rather banal narrative about heroic patriotism. But that's what all these kind of memorials are reduced to usually.
And in doing so, they lose their own agency. So, they're a symbol of something else. Anyways, I'm told by the moderator you've asked too many questions. So there we are. We'll open it up.
What were your reasons for writing this book?
Yeah, we'll just take a couple together.
What were your reasons for picking this topic for a book?
Dr. Wagner, I just want to remark on the significance that you imbued the entire incident with by giving us a kind of cinematic imagery of the spatial layout of the place itself. I think that is very, very significant in your book. You, of course, begin with mentioning Attenborough and his cinematic representation. But then, apart from the maps that you have, the way that you have graphically detailed the park itself and the well inside and the walls and the bullet marks that have faded, but again, they can be seen. I'd like you to comment on that.
just curious about whether you see Jallianwala as an inflection point in terms of the overall relationship between the Sikhs and the British.
Okay, so I actually saw the movie when it came out, and I was very young, and I remember my grandmother her sounds of horror when the massacre was depicted. So I always sort of remembered it at the back of my mind, but I'm really a 19th century historian. But I worked on 1857 and sort of the mass executions, the executions of sepoys being tied to cannon and blown to pieces. And to me, there was sort of a natural progression that is 1857 and 1919 as sort of focal points. And I work on violence, so in some ways it's sort of an obvious thing for me to do. You can also tell from the way I describe the event that the 19th century looms very large. And then I don't think that much of the other literature on the subject is very useful. So I thought there was a way for me to make a contribution, or at least tell the story in a different way. And thank you for your point about, the space. I've spent more than a month in Amritsar at different points of time, because I've been walked around, because I feel that it's not just the Bagh and that what happens that day, it's the preceding weeks, it's the riots that happens, and it's really, the urban space is absolutely crucial to understanding it. It's sort of, maybe it's the empiricist in me, but I want to know how long it takes to go from where Dai was to the Bagh, and I want to get a sense of the place itself. And actually, if you look at the map, you can explain everything by looking at the map, because you have the so-called native city, old city, and you have the railway tracks, and then you have the European lines. And it's when protesters try to break into the European lines, which is effectively a white space, and are repulsed, that the British panic, but also that the local population panic. So just looking in a more sort of critical way at the space, I think, is necessary to understand what happens. Inflection point? No, because it's not seen as a massacre of Sikhs. The crowd is not described as being Hindu or Muslim or Sikh. They're called rebels. And I don't think Jallianwala Bagh becomes a Sikh thing until Udham Singh, actually. And I think maybe even later. So I looked for where do these accounts about Udham Singh being there, handing out water, being wounded, sitting with this woman and giving water to this woman in the middle of the night. And they're from the 1960s. That's the earliest I've been able to find them. So I think, in some ways, Jallianwala Bagh as a Sikh moment is constructed much later. There's a widespread support amongst certain Sikh families for Daya, because they're all, the headmen of the villages, all the young men serve in the army, the military links are still very, very strong. The Gada movement is a spent force, but I would probably suggest that's a more important inflection point. The Gada movement, the Lahore conspiracy and Singapore mutiny. So it's 1915 in that sense. That's when the British realized that those brave, loyal warriors can also become, brave, disloyal enemies.
Love your candor, by the way.
No questions?
Hello.
You mentioned that if masses gathered, it was thought a kind of declaration of war. So, what is the impact of those thoughts in current political scenario? Is this just specified to British colonizers, or is it common phenomena with power to react in this way?
Anyone else? Back there. Yeah. Oh, and what's up there? Yeah, those two.
Thanks. I was curious about the relationship, the communal relationship unfolded about after the Jallianwala Bagh. Does this have any connection with it? That a lot of communal tensions unfolded in 20s after the Jallianwala Bagh and this whole thing, you've mentioned about.
as the name mentions, the empire affair. So I want to ask you for your comments on the current political situations and the, you can say, curbs on freedom of speech in Pakistan and India.
Yeah, I think it's a history thing, so we'll keep it to history. Anyone else? Third question. Yeah, you can ask.
Is the colonial history taught in British schools in India?
No.
That was a simple one. So the other two questions.
In terms of colonial power, yeah, I think they're very strong. I think it's distinctly colonial, and I think it's not distinctly British. And I think sort of my next project is actually about showing the commonalities between not just the European major colonial powers, Britain, France, Germany, but also America. There are, especially when we look at this period around just before the First World War, you can't tell the difference between the Germans in Southwest Africa, the Belgians in Congo, or the French in Algeria, and the British. I mean, the differences are a matter of degrees rather than particular types of colonialism. So I would also think one of the things I've tried to challenge is the notion of British exceptionalism, which is very, very strong. That goes back to your question about education. I mean, Amritsar is difficult. School teachers find it difficult to teach because it doesn't make the British look very good. And so it's easier not really to talk about in some ways, which is of course not a helpful way of teaching it. There are slight changes. There are beginning to be some changes, but with the new government, who knows? Communal tension. I think when the rioters there shot after the 10th of April, Hindus and Muslims, you actually have quite remarkable, because I mean, Kijlu and Sajapal, they're Hindus and Muslims. And also, you have accounts of Hindus burying Muslims and Muslims burning Hindus in the days after the 10th of April. There's some communal langas where people eat side by side. There's a very remarkable moment of communal unity, which is contingent, and it disappears within, probably a few months, and we have the beginning of sort of communal tension of Amritsar begins in the 20s, as you mentioned. But that's, of course, also one of the things that triggers a British panic reaction. There's nothing more supposedly unnatural than for Hindus and Muslims to get along. So if it happens, that's what happened in 1857. So if it happens again, if they unite against us, we have no, we'll be washed away by these barbarian hordes. So the very concept of Hindu-Muslim unity, when you read about it in colonial accounts, it's manufactured, it's unnatural, and it's definitely dangerous.
Any more questions? Last round. Yeah? Just wait for the mic here.
Archbishop Canterbury going there and pay homage, bring that into the British conscience, briefly. Because I know Cameron went earlier but didn't say very much. But the Archbishop at least did prostrate himself.
Right, anyone else? This one there, yeah.
My question is about law, the law of the ruler and the rule of the law. So when there is general perception within those people who are westernized, trained people, they mostly claim that the British came and they brought the rule of the law in India. And before this there was a law of the ruler prevailed in India. So my question is this: when we try to see and analyze such type of events like the Jallianwala Bagh, it also created a sense that British, instead of promoting rule of law, they were also functioning in the same way as the traditional ruler acted. What is your opinion about that?
Okay, great. Anyone else? Last question.
So I was actually surprised by the Bishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, prostrating himself in September of 2019. It came quite out of the blue. Why and I'm quite cynical, as you may have picked up on. I don't actually believe in these kind of historical, political apologies, because they are political rituals, right? No government apologizes unless there's something to be benefited from it. And so when you talk about political rituals of apologies, facts in the past are the first sort of big steps. That's not really what it's about. Apologies about the present. But for me, what's important is that he did it in his capacity as a religious figure. He hadn't been asked to do it. He didn't have Shashi Tharoor browbeating him. He wasn't dragged kicking and screaming to do it. And he did it unreservedly and prostrated himself. I mean, nobody would do that. No British politician would lay. I mean, can you imagine Boris Johnson? He wouldn't be able to get up again. So I actually, and it was spontaneous. So I thought this, I didn't expect it, and I think that is as good as a British apology is going to get. I think, because if it was a politician, we would all be, looking at what were the real motives and accusing it of not being genuine.
At least it brought it to conscious, British conscious of the British.
Yes, but I think the signal value in terms of an Indian audience was very important. And in many ways, I think the apology I never thought it was a very helpful issue to focus on apology, because that kind of makes you focus on the present rather than the past. But then I would say that as a historian. In terms of rule of law and colonial governance, I mean, it's a joke. I mean, British rule in India did not bring rule of law. It's of course one of the things that sort of helped out. But colonialism, by definition, cannot operate within the rule of law. So there's no single point. So the idea is rule of law means that an Englishman would have serve the same sentence as an Indian if they committed murder. It's demonstratively incorrect. You have right from day one. You have 1836. You have the anti-thuggy legislation, which is again a precursor to anti-terrorism laws, which suspends any notion of evidence and these kind of things. You have the Murderous Outrages Act on the Northwest Frontier. When we get into the 20th century, you have anti-sedition legislation, which is in some places still in place. I mean, the rule of law never exists in praxis within a colonial situation. And that's why, there is no such thing as a normality within a colonial situation, precisely because it is precarious and the colonial state is vulnerable. So you always have this notion of a potential emergency. So I would rather say we have a constant state of exception within the colonial context, which means that you suspend the rule of law. That it happened time again and again and again. But it was never designed like that. There's no kind of democracy or anything like that in a colonial situation, right? The electorate can't vote the British out. So the whole idea that there's some kind of proto-democratic or parliamentary democracy in place is ridiculous. But it is in legal terms. That's not to say that the British that it's only horrible or that Mughal law was somehow more enlightened. It's just a fact that rule of law did not in practice operate in British India.
Well, this week sort of connected with our last session, but the last one today. But it's actually really fascinating. This connects to the Brown attacks, perhaps. That even now the whole conception is about how you take away rights, but through a legal way. You kind of create another law to restrict you more, and that's supposed to be the rule of law. So it's very interesting where you can be as draconian as you want, but as long as it's sort of validated through some law. I guess that concept that we have now, that as soon as the Supreme Court says something, it's all fine, even if they make it up. So that's the British thing, that just create a law about this and then it will be fine. And I think, so it's a very bizarre kind of concept, but we have a whole session on the rule of law later today, so do attend that, and I'll leave the last one to Ammar.
Yes, well, first of all, I'm really glad and heartened to see so many people in a history session, because we have a very tense relationship with history, and it's supposed to be something that's already happened. And we're competing with politicians, so Kim, you should consider running for election here, because you're quite popular. It's also, I think it's reading the book, is also a fun experience because you really learn how to be objective as a historian. Because you won't get like political sound bites from this book. It's despite the fact that this is a very charged issue and a very charged topic, and there's a lot of emotion even in the way Kim writes. And yet, I think the question that one of the gentlemen up there asked, I mean, what lessons can you take from it? That I think a good writer allows the reader to take lessons, like, you know, to incite thinking, critical thinking, creativity. So of course there's nothing direct that the book says about contemporary situation, but there's a lot we can learn, and I think it's up to us how to be engaged with it. And also, like, I just wanted to comment on Amber's question. I think it's also a very important moment, not just for Hindu-Muslim Sikh unity, but for politics, modern politics as such. I mean, this is the time, post-Jallianwala Bagh massacre is the time when you really have the emergence of mass politics in India. And that, when society rises, it rises with all its spotlights. So, you know, religion was one of them, ethnicity was another, class was another. So it's really, you know, all the historically sedimented contradictions come out when the mass comes out. They don't follow one ideology. It's always a messy business, and that kind of shines through Kim's work. So I would end by, again, recommending this book, and generally recommending that people start engaging with history in Pakistan. I think that's something we ought to do, because that will allow us to learn from our past and not repeat the mistakes of the past. And I take this opportunity to again thank Dr. Kim Wagner for giving us his precious time, and thank you for your work and for the research that you're doing. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it.